Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today, really deep, into something that honestly we all experience every time we try to learn something new. You know that feeling, like how hard is this actually?
Yeah, we're talking about that, how we judge the difficulty of learning. And we've got some seriously cool research to help us unpack this, including a brand new study, hot off the press, from the Educational Psychology Review.
We're going to break it all down for you so you can understand your own learning a little better.
Exactly. And it all starts with this idea of, well, like, how much mental effort are you actually using?
Yeah, we call that cognitive load in the biz. It's basically the demand on your working memory when you're grappling with new info.
Right, that mental heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And we're focusing on, like, how you actually perceive that, how much effort it feels like you're putting in, especially when you've got a learning journey where the difficulty is all over the place.
Like, think about it. Have you ever started learning something and right out of the gate you're just like, whoa, this is way over my head? Totally. Or the opposite, where you're cruising along, feeling super smart, and then bam, it gets crazy hard.
Exactly. And that's what this study's all about, figuring out whether it's that first impression of difficulty or the stuff you wrestle with towards the end. It kind of shapes your overall feeling of, was this easy or was this a monster to learn?
Like, does that first chapter make or break the whole book kind of thing?
Exactly. And to figure this out, they use three different learning topics, each with a different level of complexity. All space-themed, too, which is cool.
Space, always a winner.
Yeah.
Okay, what were the topics?
So first up was something relatively straightforward. Why the Earth is actually closest to the Sun during, get this, winter in the Northern Hemisphere.
Ah, okay. I never really thought about that.
Right. Then they ramped up the complexity. Second topic, black holes, what they are, how they work, all that mind-bending stuff.
Yeah, black holes are definitely a step up in the brain power department. And the third one,
The third one was the big kahuna, could life on Earth, like, actually have started somewhere else in the universe. Super complex stuff.
whoa! Yeah, that'll definitely get the mental gears turning. So they had these three topics, different levels of difficulty. How did they actually go about measuring how much mental effort people were using to learn this stuff?
Okay, so typically, when you're measuring cognitive load in research, you do it after the learning's happened. You'll give people these questionnaires, self-report scales,
Hmm.
where they're like, okay, looking back, how mentally demanding was that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, do a little reflection and rate how much brain sweat you put in. But isn't there a chance that those ratings could be, like, a little off?
Well, that's what these researchers started thinking about. Like, can you really accurately remember and report the exact mental effort you felt throughout the whole learning process, especially when the difficulty's changing all the time?
That's a good point. Our memories aren't exactly perfect, are they? We tend to remember some things more vividly than others.
Right. And we know from memory research that things you experience first, that's called the primacy effect, and things you experience last, the recency effect, tend to stick in your mind better. So the question for you is, are those memory quirks maybe messing with how you report your cognitive load?
Like maybe overemphasizing that first mind-blowing concept, even if the rest was easier.
Exactly. Or maybe the last thing you learned was super simple, so you're like, oh, that whole thing was a bruise.
That's really interesting. So, how did they actually test this with those space topics?
So first, they did a pre-study to make sure they were right about the difficulty of the topics. They had people rate how complex they thought each one was, and those ratings basically confirmed their initial hunch.
So, Earth's orbit, easy peasy, black holes, a bit tougher, and origin of life, brain melter.
Yep. So they had their baseline, then they did the main study with 100 participants.
Okay, 100 space learners. What do they have to do?
They split them into two groups. One group learned the topics in order of increasing complexity, so it started with the Earth's orbit, then black holes, then the origin of life. The other group went the opposite way, started with this super complex stuff, and worked their way down to the easiest.
So, same material, just different order. Smart. Did they just ask them at the end, like, hey, how was it overall?
Not quite. They wanted more detail. So they asked them to report their cognitive load after each topic. So after the first one, then after the second, then the third, and then at the very end, they gave an overall rating for the whole shebang.
Sneaky. Okay, what did they find? Was it the first impression that mattered most or that final feeling?
The big takeaway, and this is important for you as a learner, is that the first impression of complexity was the best predictor of their overall cognitive load. Like, it didn't matter if they started easy and went hard or vice versa. That first experience was like a mental anchor.
Wow. So even if it got easier later, that initial this is hard feeling kind of colored their whole perception. That makes you think, right? Like, Have you ever written something off because the first part was confusing, even if it might have gotten easier later?
It's a real phenomenon. They call it the primacy effect. And it's actually different from what they found in research on problem solving.
Oh, really? How so?
In problem-solving studies, they tend to find that the most complex problem in a series has the biggest impact on how people rate the overall difficulty. But the researchers here point out that learning and problem-solving are different beasts, especially when it comes to feedback.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like with problem solving, you usually know right away if you got it right or wrong. That immediate feedback can really shape your perception of difficulty. But with learning, it's more about absorbing information, making connections. It's not always that clear cut.
Exactly. So failing to solve a puzzle, that's obvious. But struggling to grasp a complex concept, that can feel way more ambiguous, and that first feeling of confusion can really linger. Now, they also found that the sequence of complexity mattered, but only partially.
Partially. Okay, tell me more about that.
So when the learning material decreased in complexity, meaning they started with the hardest stuff, the overall cognitive load they reported was actually higher than just the average of their ratings after each topic.
Oh, interesting. So starting with the hardest stuff made them feel like the whole thing was even harder than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, the researchers think that when you start with something really tough, it sets this high anchor point for your perception of difficulty. Even if it gets easier later, you're still carrying that initial struggle with you. Like you might remember a course as being super difficult just because the first few weeks were brutal, even if it got easier later on.
That's a really good point. And what about when they started with the easiest stuff and worked their way up?
In that case, when the complexity increased, the overall cognitive load was pretty much the same as the average of their individual ratings. So starting easy didn't make them think the whole thing was easier than it actually was, but it also didn't inflate their perception of difficulty like starting hard did.
So it sounds like starting off with a challenge might have a bigger and potentially negative impact on your overall experience. Food for thought for anyone teaching or really just planning their own learning journey. Now, I know they also looked at different types of cognitive load, right?
They did. They looked at intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load. And these are super important to understand because they can really affect your learning.
Okay, break it down for us. What are those exactly?
All right, so first up, you've got intrinsic cognitive load. That's basically the inherent difficulty of the material itself. Like black holes are just more complex to understand than, say, why it gets colder in the winter.
Got it. Like some stuff is just naturally more mentally demanding. What about the second type, extraneous?
Extraneous load is the stuff that's added on top of that inherent difficulty because of bad design. Like think about a textbook with a confusing layout or instructions that use a bunch of jargon without explaining it. That's extraneous load mental effort that isn't actually helping you learn.
So like a poorly written manual that makes a simple task seem way harder than it needs to be.
Exactly. And then you have germane load, which is the mental effort you're putting into actually making sense of the material, like connecting new information to what you already know, building those mental models that help you learn deeply. It's the effort that leads to real understanding.
So ideally, you want to maximize that germane load, the good effort, and minimize the extraneous load from bad design, all while managing that inherent difficulty of the material itself. Makes sense. So how did these different types of load play out in the study?
Well, the intrinsic load did what they expected. It went up when the learning topics went from easy to hard and down when they went the other way. But what's fascinating is that the extraneous load seemed to mirror that. Even though the way they presented the information was the same for all three topics, people reported higher extraneous load when they perceived the material as harder, and lower extraneous load when they thought it was easier.
That's so interesting. Like maybe we subconsciously link the perceived difficulty of something with how well we think it's being explained, even if the explanation itself is fine. If it feels hard, we might just assume it's also poorly presented.
It's possible. Shows how tricky it can be to separate the difficulty of the material from how well it's being taught. Now, the findings about germane load were even more intriguing. In the group that went from easy to hard, their reported effort actually decreased as the material got harder. And when the complexity decreased, their effort increased.
Wait, that seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't you have to put in more effort when things get harder?
Right? You'd think so. The researchers think this might be about motivation. They suggested that when you hit that really complex stuff right away, it might feel so overwhelming that you actually put in less effort to understand it. Like it feels more like a threat than a challenge. But starting with something easier might build your confidence and make you more willing to really dig in when things get tougher.
So it's not just about the actual difficulty, but also your perception of it and your motivation to engage. That has huge implications for how we study learning and how we approach our own learning, right?
Absolutely. For researchers, it shows that when you measure cognitive load, really matters. A single measurement at the end might not tell the whole story. And for you, as a learner, it means that first impression of difficulty might be a lot more powerful than you realize.
So that feeling of being totally lost at the beginning of something new, don't let it completely discourage you, especially if you think it might get easier later on.
It's a reminder to be mindful of that potential primacy bias. And for anyone who designs learning experiences, this study really highlights the importance of how you sequence things. Starting too hard might make people think the whole thing is way harder than it actually is, even if it gets easier later.
So easing people into more complex stuff, starting with the basics and building from there, could make a big difference in how they experience the whole learning journey.
Definitely worth considering. Okay, so to sum it all up for our deep divers today, that first encounter with a new topic and how difficult it feels has a surprisingly big impact on how you judge the difficulty of the whole learning process.
That first impression, it really sticks with you.
And this study reminds us that how we perceive and report on our own learning, it's not always straightforward. It's a mix of the actual difficulty, how our memory works, and our own motivation to engage with the material.
This really makes you think about those times when you've struggled with something new, right? Maybe that initial feeling of, I can't do this, wasn't the whole picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of research out there on how we learn and how we can learn better.
So next time you start something new and that first hurdle feels huge, remember this conversation. Maybe that feeling is just a first impression. And maybe, just maybe, the journey ahead is a lot smoother than you think.
And with that in mind, what past learning experiences might you look at a little differently?
Something to ponder, deep divers.
Until next time.
Happy learning, everyone!